So a very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us for this talk from our 2022 visiting fellow, Yelda Nasifoglu. My name is Dr. Tabitha Tuckett, and I am Rare Books Librarian here at University College London Special Collections. And we're delighted to have this talk from Dr. Nasifoglu, who has been working here in London with us for the month as a visiting fellow at our new Research Institute for Collections. This is a new institute at UCL, which incorporates not only the archives, manuscripts and rare book collections here, but also the museum collections, and looks to find new ways of researching with this material. And we've had two visiting fellows this year, and Dr. Yelda Nasifoglu is one of them. Now, we're actually particularly delighted to have had Yelda with us during November, because Yelda has been involved in a number of projects involving some of our rare printed collections in the past. She first trained as an architect and then moved into academia and works on the history of architecture, the history of mathematics in the early modern period. And she has been involved in a couple of projects with our books and other people's books in the past. One was a project on Hook, and after that, the Reading Euclid project, and I think she's going to talk a little bit about those. So it's been wonderful for us to get to meet her and to find out more about these really international projects that have that we've been aware of in the past. What we're going to do today is to have a talk from Yelda about her work studying our mathematical collections, and then we're going to try and look at some of the books she's talking about live online. So we hope that that technology will work for that. So without any more delay, I'm going to hand over to Yelda to talk to us about reading and collecting early modern mathematics. Over to you, Yelda.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, for this wonderful introduction, and to the whole staff of UCL Rare Books Collection who have patiently fetched books for me. And I've been very grateful for the support, of course, I received on the fellowship, but also I've appreciated the extensive collections at UCL, which was actually surprising to me. But I will get to speak a little bit about those collections to inspire others' interest in the UCL collections in general. Now I will share my screen and turn off my camera just to save some bandwidth. All right. Okay, I think that is working. So I will now try to see if I can turn off my camera. Okay. Wonderful. My research has been supported by numerous numerous libraries and institutions, and I've been quite grateful for all the support I received. So I will give you an overall general overview of the research I'm doing, and then speak a little bit about what I've done at UCL and show you a few very interesting books that I got to study there. Sorry, before I go there, to give an overall view as to why I've been interested in mathematical books. As Tabitha explained, my background is in architecture, and I was trained as an architect. I practiced as one before going into academia. And what prompted me to do so was, at the time, the increasing influence computers had been exerting on how architecture was being practiced, and it's gotten even more so now. Now, architecture has had a traditional relationship with its tools, like compass and rule, which symbolized the field, and they reflected these tools. They reflected how buildings were made, how they were constructed. So there's a relationship between the symbol and the actuality of building. So I became interested in the history of this new tool of computers, of logic, of algebraic mathematics, and to understand how they may affect architecture at a fundamental, at a philosophical level. Now, what I wasn't expecting is finding a similar shift in 17th century England when the figure of the professional architect began to emerge. Now, architecture-wise, the Renaissance hadn't quite reached these shores until the early 1600s, when the medieval guild system was still intact. So craftspeople were learning their trade hands-on on the construction site. But especially in the latter half of the century, you had people who had no construction experience take on the role of the architect. Now, one of these people were actually Robert Hooke, on whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation. I concentrated on his architectural work, and especially in relation to his, I think, distinctive approach to mathematics. I tried to understand this phenomenon of learning craft knowledge from books and its consequences when this knowledge is then applied to the construction site, for instance. Now, this may be of interest to some of you. I looked closely at one of the projects that Hooke and Wren worked on, the Fleet Canal, and noticed, I realized reading the primary sources that Wren and Hooke really had no idea about how to construct this canal. And they had to constantly refer to the craftsmen and left a lot of the work to the ingenious craftsman to figure out. And then, the craftsman was actually, the head craftsman was actually knighted at the end of that project. So Hooke and Wren were learning not only from books, but from craftsmen as well. But mainly it was the books that gave them this new knowledge into this new kind of discipline called architecture. And we do have another instance of this where Hooke actually used a foundation system that he saw in a book of Alberti's 10 Books of Architecture. There was an illustration of an inverted arch system for unstable ground, which he actually used in the Montague House, which became the first building of the British Museum, actually. So they were learning from books and applying this knowledge to the field. And I've been interested in what they were reading and how this might have influenced how architecture became practiced in the 18th century and on. Now, the other projects that sorry, I'm trying to switch my screen. Yes, the other projects that have prompted my my interest in books has been hookesbooks.com, which I collaborated on with Will Poole at New College and Felicity Henderson. And we looked at Hooke's library catalog, the auction catalog, as well as extant books from his libraries. And of course, the Reading Euclid project, which I worked on with Philip Deely and Benjamin Wardaw, where we looked at how Euclid was read, consumed by the readers in the 17th century, and different approaches to the editions themselves, the different kinds of books, different kinds of editions that were being produced. Now, as part of that Euclid project, I became aware, well, we all became aware that just looking at extant copies of Euclid was not really giving us an accurate picture of what was going on in the 17th century, because with all the fires and all the, there was even the Second World War actually decimated many libraries with many books. So how do we approach this? How do we know what people were reading? What editions of Euclid were they reading? So we started looking at book catalogs. They could be auction catalogs, anonymous catalogs, all kinds of catalogs, and I'll get into that, just to keep track of what we were looking at, just to write down, oh, we looked at this catalog to see if there were any Euclids. So this actually became the catalog of catalogs. The father of the title is Benjamin Wardaw. And so that actually grew a little bit out of hand, if I am to be honest. When I started building this relational database, I thought it'd be a few hundred catalogs, but right now it's at close to, I think I've passed the 2,000 mark. And what it is just for those who are interested in these kinds of digital humanities projects. I've not only been recording the metadata in the catalog of catalogs for the catalogs, but also copying whatever I'm able to get my hands on, the catalogs themselves. And the kinds of catalogs that I'm including are in print, in manuscript, and what I would call in fragment. Now, in print, it's fairly obvious, and you can read this on your screens. There are a lot of printed booksellers and auction catalogs, especially from 1676, when this became a practice in London, and all kinds of bibliographies and some bequest catalogs, such as the Bibliotheca Norfolkiana, the library that was donated to the Royal Society, but also in manuscript. So I've been looking at personal library lists, wills and inventories that include book titles. Not all of them do. Sometimes it just says 10 books in the living room, etc. Lists of desiderata. So these could be little notes, for instance, that Hooke wrote of his interests in which books he wanted to bid on in an auction. This became interesting to me because then I knew that he had access to, let's say, a specific edition of Vitruvius, but just wasn't interested in it. So it wasn't only what he bought, but what he chose not to buy. And these gave me an idea about what was in the market at the time. And of course, for those interested, catalogs of confiscated libraries are a fantastic resource as well, and they are in the state papers. Of course, now, while I've been trying to limit this to continental Britain, to the island of the British Isles. I know it's I know that's not the right word to use, British Isles anymore, but the United Kingdom and Ireland as well. Now we know that there were Catholic colleges that were formed in the 17th century on the continent, both Irish Catholic colleges and English Catholic colleges. And so I've been interested in their collections as well, because there were exchanges between the UK and these Catholic colleges. And in Fragment, I think this is very important because not all lists have survived, especially for people like women. So women's ownership of books may not be reflected in extant library lists, but we do see their ownership marks. And I will show you a few of these later on. So we do know they own books. So this is one way of reconstituting a catalog based on these ownership marks. And of course, there are subscriber lists of individual titles. These become especially common in the 18th century. For instance, I've seen an architectural book which lists not only the subscribers, but their professions as well. So you see mason, carpenter, etc. It's very interesting. So just to give some examples of these catalogs, these are some of the ones that I've looked at and I'm able to share because they're not restricted. The British Library, I haven't been able to, of course, get permissions to show you those, but there are many catalogs that are printed and of course annotated. So at the bottom right, you see an annotated auction catalog that I'll show some more examples from later on. And these are, of course, manuscript catalogs, and I'll show a few more slides on those. And these are the fragments, what I meant by reconstituting book lists from ownership inscriptions, but also from the so-called hammer copies of auction catalogs, which note the names of the buyers. Now, out of this research, what I wanted to gather is an idea about who purchased, collected, and read mathematical texts in the early modern period. And I've been interested in whether their professional identities changed over time. So were they scholars at the beginning, and then did they become practitioners later on? And if so, how did the book trade accommodate these various different, these changes in professions? So did the scholars get a specific type of book? And I think you can gather that I do think so. And were there smaller books that were made for students and practitioners, etc.? And how did the special challenges of printing mathematical books, so illustrations, lengthy tables that required a large investment of number types, affect their cost and audience? Now, I'll scroll back. what attracted me to UCL, as I said, is there a large collection of mathematical books. Now, the largest portion of these comes from the Graves collection, named after John Thomas Graves, an Irish jurist who was a professor of jurisprudence at UCL in 1639 to 43. Now, Graves had more than a passing interest in mathematics. He worked on logarithms and even had a paper published in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions. He was friends with the mathematician Augustus de Morgan, whose own collection is now at the Senate House, which is in fact called the Morgan Library, and which, according to their website, has about 3,800 items on mathematics printed between 1474 and 1870, many of them actually bearing his annotations in case you are interested. But Graves, it appears, managed to assemble a much larger collection, which he bequeathed to UCL. These are about 9,000 items, 51 of them manuscripts. The rest are rare books, pamphlets, and journals, and they cover the period between the Middle Ages up to the 19th century. And a quarter of these are from pre-1700. So I'd been looking at a selection of those. The topics covered include both what we would now call pure mathematics and practical mathematics, which of course included surveying, building, architecture, astronomy, physics, astrology, etc. Now, the Euclid collection available in UCL Staros Niarchos Foundation Digital Library, a lot of these come from the Graves Library, in fact. And there's also the OGDEN collection, which has some significant mathematical books. So Charles K. Ogden was a linguist and bookseller, and he collected about 5,000 items, which included manuscripts in cunabula and rare books. And the books range from the 15th to the 20th centuries. And what's particularly interesting about the Ogden collection is that Ogden was interested in language and communication and cryptography, semantics. So he collected books with annotations. So from his collection, we have some books annotated by John Dee, and we will show one copy at the end of this presentation. This collection, the Ogden collection, was purchased by UCL in 1943. Now, I just want to also mention that the UK has quite a few mathematical book collections. One of these is the Euclid collection at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, which has about 300 volumes representing 270 editions of all works ascribed to Euclid. And it had been assembled by Charles Thomas Stanford, who was a lawyer and a politician and the author actually of a bibliography of Euclid's works published by the Bibliographical Society in 1926. So these are some of the collections that those of you interested in mathematical books may be interested in actually going and exploring. Sorry. Now, I wanted to speak a little bit about mathematical book owner and readership. Now, of course, it makes sense that mathematicians would own mathematical books. So here I have a page of the, well, it's a scroll, so part of the Bibliotheca Savilliana, the collection that was given to the civilian professors of mathematics and astronomy by Henry Saville, who established the professorships in, I think, 1920. And on the right, we have the 1533 Greek edition, which is dated to Princeps of Euclid's Elements of Geometry. And you will see it bearing his annotations. It's densely annotated, which almost becomes a second edition of the book. And then, and what's interesting is that those particular annotations actually end up, sorry, I didn't include that image. They actually end up in another copy in the Marquis of Dorchester's copy at Royal College of Physicians. So this is actually Dorchester's library list that was donated to the Royal College of Physicians, and it has an extensive selection of mathematical books. Dorchester was not a mathematician, perhaps. He was an aristocrat, but he was interested in mathematics. And the reason why he was collecting these mathematical books as an aristocrat wasn't because he wanted to build a fancy library per se, but because he was actually interested in mathematics. And in fact, we have 2 of his notebooks on Apollonius's conics at the British Library. So he was actively maybe he was not a published mathematician, but he was interested heavily in mathematics. And John Selden, of course, who a large portion of whose library ended up at the Bodleian, also collected a lot of mathematical books. And he was a lawyer and scholar. But also we see women owning mathematical books. And I must say, I searched high and wide for ownership by women of mathematical books. You usually get a lot of prayer books or, more domestic oriented books owned by women. But I was extremely excited to see that there's a copy at UCL of Wilkins's Mathematical Magic, the 4th edition from 1691, which was owned by Anne Wade, who I haven't really been able to track down yet, but her signature is from 1744. And we have another case of Elizabeth Gray owning a copy of Wilkins's Mathematical Magic, the 1648 edition. Now that is, I don't think it's dated by her, but it was owned by, clearly it has this ownership inscription by Elizabeth Gray on the cover itself, on the title sheet itself, sorry. Now, I have been wondering the different kinds of readerships, and this particular book, I wondered why women would be interested in owning this. And I think it's partly because it's a book of wonder. So I just included a couple of illustrations from the book, and it has these illustrations of magical, not magical in the sense of magic, but in terms of mathematics and its capabilities, technological capabilities, and its ability to inspire wonder in people. In fact, when Thomas Hood was giving his inaugural lecture on mathematics in 1588 in London, he was explaining how useful mathematics was, but he concentrated on its thaumaturgy, the ability to make these objects of wonder, of beautiful things with mathematics. So I think mathematics has this dimension of inspiring wonder in people. And so a lot of these books that maybe involved, maybe concentrating on physics or mechanics, actually are also interesting in terms of what technology is able to accomplish, what wonderful things we can make with mathematics. Now, mathematical book acquisition, I wanted to speak a little bit about these different kinds of documentation we have out there for those who are interested in, who are buying these books. Now, we have one example in the UCL collection. It's an acquisition note in John Wallace's book Against Hobbes. It was purchased in Lord Brereton's auction in 1697. So auctions are actually a very good source for understanding who owned mathematical books. Now, of course, I mentioned the Robert Hooke's Library project, which looked at the auction catalog of Hooke's Library, and it's a record of how much was paid for each book. However, we don't know who purchased these books, but it's a good source if you're interested in the book prices from the period. And we have another example. This is from the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. It's a fantastic interleaved copy of Moses Pitt's 1678 catalog of a supposed auction of Voigt's library. Now, I said supposed because there's some new scholarship suggesting that it's probably very little to do with Voigt, and it was whatever he had in stock in his collection. Now, a bookseller has actually inserted leaves in between and recorded prices, the same titles and additional titles that are not in the Voigt catalog, what these books fetched at various auctions up to 1682. So it's a really fantastic resource. Another resource we have, and that didn't include owners, but what I mentioned are hammer copies. So this is a hammer copy of the catalog of William Hopkins's auction that took place in Oxford in 1701. And it's extremely interesting in that it's not only recording the names of the buyers, but also the colleges they belong to. So these auction catalogs, especially hammer copies, provide us with a lot of information on who was purchasing these books. They are not, sometimes they're not very useful in the sense that there are agents who are purchasing the books, so we don't exactly know who the end buyer was. And sometimes booksellers purchase these books for their own collections. But it could be one way of tracking down, for instance, the authors of annotations in books, if we can find out where that particular copy was purchased from, if the owner of the auction is known. Now, I also wanted to say a few things about why I think the history of the book is important for the history of mathematics. Now, one example, again, comes from my Robert Hooke research for my dissertation. Robert Hooke attended Westminster School under the directorship of Richard Busby. And that school also saw the likes of Christopher Wren and many others that Hooke would know in the Royal Society later on. Now, Busby actually opened his library to the students. So we know that Hooke spent some quality time in his library learning Euclid, for instance. And Busby's library catalog, when we look at it and when we look at the books that were owned in it, when I compared these with Hooke's library, I saw that there are a lot of overlaps. What I haven't done is see whether this was what was on the market or whether this can be deemed an influence of Busby on his pupils later on in terms of what books they would be interested in reading later on in terms of mathematics. And further interesting thing to note is these book lists give us an idea about how mathematical knowledge was disseminated. Now, there is a catalog of the Gloucester School library, which was actually run by Maurice Wheeler, who was a correspondent of the Royal Society. And we see that Wheeler had actually brought in quite a lot of books on mathematics into the school's library. A lot of these books are no longer at the King's School in Gloucester, so we wouldn't know this unless we had access to this book list. So this is an important, I think, document showing us that the Royal Society and its fellows were actually trying to disseminate mathematical knowledge outside of London. And we have other schools that were formed, for instance, the Whitehaven school, mathematical school in Whitehaven near Cumbria. There are a lot of other examples of mathematical schools being built or formed, of course, for a lot of them for poor students or orphans. So towards the beginning of the 18th century, we start seeing mathematical education spreading throughout Britain. And I think this is important in terms of understanding what happened subsequently, the Industrial Revolution. Oops, sorry. Now, one thing we can, of course, we can always look at, I'm going to stop sharing my screen 1 second, sorry. Of course, we can look at book lists and see what people were buying, exchanging, etc. But we don't really get a sense of what these books are until we look at the actual books themselves. Now, of course, during the pandemic, perhaps we've all become accustomed to seeing these books online in digitized form, which has been, of course, extremely important to continue our research. However, when you see the books themselves, you start understanding the different purposes they were constructed for. Of course, some of them are obvious. You get the big folios, which are scholarly editions. You have the tiny little books that are pocket books for reference for practitioners. But some of the books, some of the folios, you start realizing are not made equal. So I was hoping that Tabitha could set up now the visualizer to show us a few examples of these folios and see what we may be able to understand from their construction. And just get this resizing my window. So Tabitha right now has a copy of Oronce Finn or Fournier. I'm just going to call him Finn, just because I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name. But this is the Protomathesis of Oronce Finn, and it was published in 1532. I'm just looking for my notes. Oh, I think it says 1632, if I'm not completely mistaken. And what I didn't know, what I hadn't realized about this book is how it's really made for perhaps reading at the lectern. It's a class instruction on teaching instruction. A manual of teaching instruction. So if Tabitha could maybe flip through some of the pages. The text itself is very large. Actually, the font is very large. So this is how I realized it was probably put on a lectern and read at some distance. And perhaps there was some kind of a pointer showing the illustrations to the students, because some of them are really big illustrations. There is no reason for them to take up half the page. So this is, of course, this makes sense. This was published after Finn's appointment as to the newly created position of Royal Lecturer in Mathematics. This had been established by Francis I. And Finn had designed maps and instruments for the king. And he was involved in mathematical book publishing earlier on. He had some experience in Perbach's Theoreticae Planetarum and Sacrobosco's De Sphera. So he was involved in the publications of these. And he is, the book mentions that he's the author of the figures in this book. And they are very detailed figures that are very explanatory in terms of how to use the instruments to measure distances and angles. And it's beautifully laid out. I don't know if you'll agree, but these are very intricately made woodcuts. This is, the 1530s, so it's very early on. So this is what I meant in terms of the size of these images. They're really, really large. So, the students, I imagine gathering around the teacher, looking at the book, as he's pointing to how to use these instruments or how to draw these different shapes. Now, it's a book that's made up of 4 parts. It covers arithmetic and geometry, and astronomy and astronomical instruments, and sundials and quadrants, etc. So this is it starts out with the more maybe theoretical but still useful practices of arithmetic and geometry, but goes into clockmaking afterwards. So if we could flip through a few more past illustrations, Tabitha. This obviously cost a lot of money to make, but it was his basically his curriculum for teaching, we assume. This is still some 40 years before John Dee and Billingsley's edition of Euclid's 10 books, 10 elements, that was published in London in 1570, right? So this is, predated by 40 years, but I'm fairly sure Dee was influenced on, Day, the publisher was probably influenced by the layout in this particular book. Now, the second title I wanted to show is another kind of teaching book, but with very different illustrations. This is Jean Ciermans. So it was published about 100 years later in, I think, 1630. I'm having problems with finding my notes. 1631, sorry. So this is about 100 years after Oronce, and it's very different in nature. So if we can look at the first, the title page, Tabitha. Now, Jean Ciermans was a Jesuit teacher who taught at the University of Louvain. Now, he was a professor of mathematics, which was, of course, a new field that started really spreading with the Jesuit school network. Some of you may be familiar with Ratio Studiorum, which was formed in 1599, which included a large section, or considerable section, on mathematical disciplines to teach at the Jesuit schools. Now, Jesuit schools, of course, were a global phenomenon at this time, but there was no systemic way of controlling the curriculum. So Ratio Studiorum was a way of kind of teaching the same thing in every school around the globe. And so this is supposed to cover the topics that Ciermans is teaching in his mathematics course. If we can forward, look at some of the images. Now, it covers an entire year, and it's supposed to be the curriculum, I think, of covering 12 different mathematical disciplines, and it goes by month and week. And the illustrations you will see are very different in nature. They are pretty in interesting, positions, kind of doing something related to the topic that's being discussed, but they're not really made for instructing you how to do this. I say it's not instructing you to how to draw geometrical shapes, or build clocks, or show you the mathematics behind optics. They are really just images, probably to inspire some interest in these probably younger students in the topic. Now, the images must have been so interesting that when Hooke was missing one from his particular copy, he actually copied it in manuscript from another book, but he copied the illustration as well, which was just a woman lying down and holding some instruments. So the illustrations must have been a source of fascination for a lot of people, and may have been very useful for teaching mathematics to the younger generations. And you may know that Hooke was the Gresham Professor of Geometry, and he gave weekly lectures on the topic, and sometimes to younger students at the Royal Mathematical School. I think we're a bit blurry here. Okay. And in this, the UCL's copy seems to be missing some pages. So these illustrations may have been perhaps sold individually as well. And this book went through numerous editions. I haven't been able to figure out exactly how many, but at least seven editions. And it was actually sold, the 1645 edition was sold to Mr. David for 12 shillings and two pence at Jonas Moore's auction in 1684. And just to give another example, looking for Oronce Fin. Oronce Fin's book actually fetched only 1 shilling and 6 pence, and sometime between 1678 and 1682. It's mentioned in the Voet catalog, but we don't know the who actually purchased the book. But it's considerably cheaper than the Ciermans, which is 11 shillings, 2 pence. Oronce Fin has fetched 1 shilling, 6 pence. And as a bonus, we get this presumably an image of the teacher scratched on the back cover of the book. I don't know if you can see the figure, but I don't know what he's holding in his very squiggly arms, but we assume that it's the teacher. Okay, I think we can switch to our third example, which is a copy of Astronomicon, and it was owned by none other than John Dee. It's dated. The book is dated 1533, I think. So we can look at maybe the ownership inscription. So this is in the Ogden collection, who, as Tabitha warned me, is interested in annotations. So if you ever want to look at annotated books, you may want to prefer the Ogden collection. And there are a few other John Dee annotated books in the same collection, but we picked this one just to kind of limit ourselves to a few books. So John Dee actually purchased this early on in his career. Oh, fantastic. Presumably before he became an astrologer. So it's assumed, it's noted that this was probably one of the ways in which he instructed himself in astrology. And we can see his annotations throughout the book. Most of them are in Latin, but there are a couple of English annotations, interesting English annotations in the back. So what Dee is doing is the annotations are close to what we have experienced, what we have seen in other books in terms of the types of annotations. He's sometimes noting marginally the mention of a specific place like Babylon, just to remind himself later on to find it. Sometimes he's referring to other parts in the book. He says, look in this section for a continuation of the topic, etc. There's a lot of underlining. There are also symbols he uses, which are, we don't know exactly what they mean. Of course, there may be some John Dee experts among you who would be able to tell us, perhaps. So this is another type of books as sites of learning, but this is more at a personal level. So if Finn's book was made to be read at a lectern with students around, and Ciermans was supposed to inspire interest in mathematics by these younger generation of students, this is really a scholar reading and learning about the topic very closely, holding the book very close to himself and annotating in the margins. Now we have one last book that's Fournier's edition of Euclid, which we included just to be able to contrast with these other volumes because of its size. So the Fournier edition, which is very small. Were you able to fetch that one, Tabitha? Yeah, there you go. It has the same kind of cheap cover as the Ciermans, but the Fournier is actually made probably for students or for pocket reference for, different propositions of Euclid. So you can quickly flip through it and find the part that you're interested in. And these were cheaply produced. And this one was, let me find my notes. This was actually sold at Jonas Moore's auction, not this particular copy, but a copy of Fournier's Euclid was sold at Jonas Moore's auction. It was very cheap. So for 10 pennies, 10 pence, sorry. So it was sold for 10 pence. So we have the Oronce fin sold for 11 shillings, 2 pence. Ciermans sold for 11 shillings, 2 pence. The Oronce fin sold for 1 shilling, 6 pence. And the Fournier sold for just 10 pence. And we know that John Aubrey, in his book, in his manuscript on educating gentlemen, he had a whole section on mathematics. He was highly suggesting that the students actually owned a copy of the Fournier Euclid, and we see it mentioned in schools, lists of schoolboys books. So we know that it was a very popular edition for a cheap popular edition for use by younger students. Now, I think this is where I will end. We really wanted to show more books, but it's very difficult to set up. And there are, there's also, I didn't have time to go into this, but we can also see different types of solutions to mathematical book printing. For instance, Shiner's book on sunspots is a huge tome. I never realized how big that book was. And then it's very interestingly printed. It has engravings printed with woodcuts and text laid out. So it must have been extremely challenging to produce that book, but it's huge. And I haven't been able to check how much it cost in different auctions, but it must have been at least very expensive to produce. I don't know how much it may have sold for afterwards. And there are also small books that are made for practitioners, like John Sellers books, for instance, with a lot of engraved plates with text, just to be able to get them very small. And those are really one way of meeting the challenge of producing small practical books while using a lot of text that are difficult to lay out with our regular type. And so yes, I think this is where I will end. I'm hoping that people have questions or comments, and we can continue the discussion afterwards. And I think we're going to stop the recording before we take on questions, so people feel freer to ask them. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yelda, for that wonderful talk. And thank you to those people behind the scenes, Rebecca Seymour, who is administrator for our new Research Institute for Collections, Erica Delbecq, head of Rare Books, and Joanna Baines, who is our academic liaison, librarian, archivist for UCL East.